morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I was really afraid that at 8 o'clock in the morning, I would be really talking about the sad emotional life of a data scientist because no one would be here. So this is really wonderful. I would like to, before I get started, my name is Anthony Scriffignano. I'm the Chief Data Scientist at Dun & Bradstreet. And before I do anything else, I'd like to ask, with your cooperation, for you to help me participate in an experiment that I'm doing. So if those of you that don't want to do it, just don't play, but please, everybody play, because it's really important. So I'm going to raise my hand, and when I raise my hand, I'd like you to just clap one single time, exactly once. Does everybody understand? Okay, ready? Put your coffee down first. Okay, here we go. Great, that was the practice clap. Now I'm going to do it one more time. Ready? Okay, there's always an overachiever. Now, I'm going to do it one more time, and this time I'd like you to clap 3 times. Instead of clapping once, just clap 3 times. Ready? What did you notice? Yes. What did you notice? You all clapped in unison. How does that happen? I didn't say, ready, set, go. I didn't say clap exactly 3 times. I gave you no sense of cadence or pace. I was paying attention to it. How did you know how fast to clap? You listen to what? You listen to other people clapping, and they're listening to you clapping, and somehow we all coordinate around a pace and a cadence and a volume, and we do that. Our brains, the neural network that we're born with in our head, does that, and we don't understand how. It just happens. Now, here's the really crazy fact. If you were to look at a recording of what just happened, and we're making one so you can watch it, it wasn't nearly as coordinated as you remember it. Because the other thing our brains do is our brains organize the information around us, and they make us see patterns that aren't necessarily there. You know when you're driving and the radio's going and the windshield wipers are going, you go, oh, look at that, the windshield wiper. They're not. You just think they are. Sorry. So, you know, we're surrounded by amazing combinations and transformations of data that are happening in our head all the time. And then somehow, when we look at spreadsheets and we look at data sets and we look at Hadoop clusters, and data lakes, and it's just the data. It is what it is. It's right there. There it is. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but things aren't the way we think all the time. And we put a lot of emotion into trying to make them fit that mental model that we have. Our systems are not nearly as coordinated and not even a little bit as adept at manipulating things to create patterns so that we can see sort of truth and meaning. There are those that argue that our ability to do this is one of the reasons why the human species has survived. How many people are staying in this hotel? No one. I don't see anyone. How many people can afford to stay in it? How many of you came in from the street door where as you walked in, the front desk would have been on your left? Almost everybody came in the other door, which is what I would think of as the back door. I don't know. How many of you noticed the dining area? Pretty cool, huh? Right? Amazing. Absolutely amazing, right? Give me 2 adjectives to describe the dining area. Expensive and expansive, right? Very good, right? But really, I mean, I don't care if you're the most jaded person in the world. You can't walk past that dining room and not go, right? At least when you see it, don't take a picture of me doing that, right? You got to be very careful. Watch this. No. So it's very easy to walk past information and ignore it because your brain's doing that for you. Well, algorithms are easily distracted by information that is bright and shiny. And people, I got to find the Pacific, whatever this is, room. I got to go to the place. I got to do the thing. I got to talk to the guy. I'm on a call. And your brain can fix all that. Not one single person in this room is thinking about how their shoes feel right now. Now, you're all thinking about how your shoes feel. Now, some of you are trying not to think about how your shoes feel, right? This is the emotional side of data processing, and our algorithms are starting to become aware. They're starting to be able to do some of this stuff. Nowhere near the way we do, but definitely starting to do some of this stuff. I was sitting at breakfast this morning, and I'm working on one of my, my phone or my iPad, and I get the ding, and it was somebody replying, somebody that I know in China, who I had wished a happy birthday, responding to me in California from Mount Everest Base Camp. And I have to go, think about what just happened in almost real time. We had this, I'm not where I live, the device follows me around, the data is coming from, I don't even want to think about how it gets from whatever that is, 25,000 feet, 8,000 something meters, the base camp, right? So we have to think about this because this phenomenon is starting to happen all around us. And we have to stop thinking of our data as something that we just repose in a database or a data lake or a place, and it's there and we're done. There are some inconvenient truths that we have to start paying attention to. Data is real, it ages. Data you collected yesterday is not 1 day old, it's data you collected yesterday. Not all data is true. Not all true data is simultaneously true. All of these things are inconvenient truths that are part of this emotional side of thinking about data. So when we think about that sort of messy word cloud, and I made this word cloud, so this is how I think about data. These are the bigger things are the things I worry about more, and the smaller things are things I still worry about because I put them in the word cloud, right? I think about, am I allowed to use this data? Permissible use, that's becoming a very big deal right now. Relationships, how one thing connects to another, how you and your shoes connect. And by the way, you had forgotten about it until I just reminded you, right? I can do this all day long, right? We have to start to think about dyadic and multiple party relationships and how they inform behavior. We have to start to think about what we can infer about what we can't see from what we can see. What are the implications of collecting data and not using it? I'm wearing one of those fitness monitors, right? It's not making me fit, but I'm wearing a fitness monitor, right? And it's collecting all kinds of data, and that data is being used in my mind, for the app that tells me how many steps I walked and all kinds of, collected information about. Well, recently they used a bunch of collected fitness monitor data because it also monitors when you're sleeping to figure out when a whole bunch of people woke up to coordinate that with an earthquake. Now, I don't know about you, but I didn't think about my data being crowdsourced like that for some other use. And I'm okay with them studying it for earthquake purposes. I don't know if they're interested in who woke up and who didn't or why, but I'm not so sure I feel good about knowing that they anonymized it. I'm not so sure I want somebody I don't know somewhere in the world analyzing when I went to bed and when I woke up. I have enough trouble with the people in my life who do comment on that because I don't get enough sleep, right? And it's all with love, right? It's an issue, right? Our data is being used in ways we don't intend to do magical and amazing things, and also some things that are pretty scary. And so that's also part of this emotional side of data, is what's it doing when it breathes in, breathes out? Our data is starting to become aware, right? And here's the real irony. We're starting to become aware that our data is starting to become aware. Think about that for a little while. It's like an artist painting a picture of an artist painting a picture of an artist. So there's more to this question than just, well, what's it all about? What's going on? And I've got 3 frames that I want to share with you in the time that we have left. One is something about the fact that we change when we measure. When we touch things, when we look at them, those things are never the same again. There's an old saying that you can't step into the same river twice, because when you step into the river, you change it and it changes you. You can't argue that your foot isn't wet when you get out, right? So don't tell me it's the same river. And you didn't have a wet foot a minute ago, right? So the data changes when we look at it. And I'll talk about some ways that happens. So we change when we measure something, and we also influence the place we look in strange and mysterious ways. And we also influence what we find. We have bias. We interpret. We, like you did with your hands clapping, we do things to make things fit. I'm sure we've all studied things like confirmation bias and the Hawthorne effect. And you study this stuff and you take the test and you move on. Well, it's time to dust off those notes, because it's happening every day, billions of times a day. And you better be aware of it if you're living in a world where your data is aware of you. Excuse me. So let's start with this first thing, that we change when we measure. So I'm not talking about the data yet, I'm talking about us. And I want to tell you a story about soup. So I started my college career, or whatever you call it, in physics. I loved and still do love physics. Really, really was interested in physics, particularly nuclear physics. I know I'm a dork, okay? And do we have anybody here that has a background in physics or chemistry or anything like that? Because I'd like you to keep me honest, if you would. Physics or chemistry? Chemistry, excellent. We can argue later, because chemistry and physics are the same thing, right? Yeah. So I was in a class, an advanced physics class, and the professor, with an impish grin, said, for your next lab, and you have a week to prepare, I'd like you to construct an experimental design to accurately measure the temperature of soup. And then he closed his notebook and walked out. So that's all we had. And we had the rest of the class period to discuss what we all just heard and what we think he meant. And it was a pretty important, there aren't that many labs. And so you start to talk about it. Well, oh, he did say, and there are two caveats. One, you cannot destroy the soup when you're measuring it. And two, you have to eat the soup when you're done measuring it. And those are actually very important rules, and I could explain why, but they're not part of my story, so talk to me later. So we start talking about this, and the first thing that comes into mind is, well, we don't have an operational definition of soup. What is soup? Soup could be anything, right? Lava is soup. I wouldn't want to have to eat it, but it's soup, right? And so, after a long discussion, we decide that the thermal characteristics of interaction, if you eat something like stew that has peas and carrots, and really complicated, because all of those things have to be heated to reach some thermodynamically stable state in order for you to accurately measure the temperature. And what is that state? And you have to practically boil it in order to reach that thermodynamic stability. And then when you boil it, you're destroying the soup. And here we go, he's maniacal, right? So we finally wind up with, you need things that have homogeneity, that are more or less all the same. And the thicker, the better, because then they will have a higher specific heat capacity. I'm not going to get into all the physics, right? So you wind up with stuff like tomato bisque, or there's always somebody that wants to do vichyssoise and take the potatoes out, and just get the milky part, because they want to do something cold. And so you basically have hot, thick, homogeneous soups and cold, thick, homogeneous soups. And the different camps arguing about whether it's easier to measure a colder temperature or a warmer temperature. We go into class a week later, different groups, and we all do more or less the same thing. We bring our thermos with our soup in it. We put it into some sort of a pot. We heat it, or some of us don't. We put it into a calorimeter, which is a fancy container with a top, and you stick a thermometer into it. It's called a thermocouple. And we all failed. Now, those of you that immediately nodded need to recuse yourselves. Why did we all fail? No. What's wrong with sticking the thermometer in it? The thermometer has a temperature, and when you measure the temperature of the soup with the thermometer in it, you're measuring the temperature of the thermometer soup system, which is not what we were asked to do. You get the first data love hat. Ooh, okay. They're cool. They're only available in limited quantity and only right here, but you have to say something really intelligent. Everybody say E equals MC. No, wait, I don't have enough hats. All right, so that's a problem, right? Now, why is he talking about soup? Why does this matter? I'm from Dun & Bradstreet. What do? Commercial risk, commercial opportunity, sales, marketing, total risk, total opportunity all over the world. What does that have to do with soup? Well, guess what? There's bad guys out there. And some people don't tell the truth. When we establish their information, we establish it from multiple sources. We update it millions of times a day, but at some point, somebody asks you something and you tell them an answer. How many employees do you have, sir? And it's very hard to validate some of that. We can triangulate, we can compare it to ratios, we can do different things, but at the end of the day, people speak, either electronically or actually speak. And bad guys, when they're lying to us, haven't really committed the fraud yet. They're going to lie to us to go commit fraud with somebody else, right? So it's what's called a second order effect. It's even more complicated. But here's the rub. If we just model the behavior of the bad guys that we catch or that get caught, and we build new algorithms to check people behaving like that, Well, the bad guys, when they're observed, what's the first thing they do? They change their behavior, right? Well, if they change their behavior and we model everything we've seen, we're modeling what we know they're not doing anymore. Right? There's a problem. So we can't use regressive methods. Where's all my math people? Come on, we know who you are. Okay. Regression equation, look at the longitudinal data, establish an equation, calculate R squared, move on, have a nice day. Nobody's going to sue me, right? Because there's some preconditions there, right? You have to have a certain type of distribution. You have to know that the future looks like the past. None of those things are true. So sit down and shut up. We need to do a different kind of math. We need to use algorithms that think. We need to use algorithms that learn. And we know for a fact that that data changed when we looked at it. The data changed when we looked at it. So we have to be careful not to think about this data that we're using as this sort of static, blah, 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 zeros and ones kind of thing. It's not, it ain't necessarily so, to quote the song. I love that song. But there's some tools. There's some tricks, and I'm going to give you one. It's this thing called a dispositive threshold. Big words for saying when you have enough data to make a decision. When something is dispositive, it can be disposed of, right? So the dispositive threshold is when you have enough data to make a decision. However, the footnote should be, it's not when you necessarily have enough data to make a good decision. So be very careful when you're at that dispositive threshold and somebody's beating you up, saying, what's the answer, what's the answer, what's the answer? Not to just give them the answer before you stop and think, by what right do I use the data I have to answer the question that's being posed? Because that's a very big, important question. By what right am I using this data to answer that question? If I hand you a bunch of data and I say, could you use this data to prove, you should stop me right there. And you should say, well, I can maybe use this data to study whatever it is you want to study. But if you're going to ask me to use a certain set of data to prove something you've already decided, then you might want to go find somebody else, because it's not my first rodeo. So that's the way we need to think. If you're going to think like a scientist, you have to behave that way. Now, the data in hand is always going to be that data that has allowed you to reach the dispositive threshold. So I don't know if anybody's following the news, but there's a hurricane coming, right? I have data in hand as I looked at the weather report this morning, and I have some idea of what I think is going on. I live in New Jersey. I'd like to get back there. I care about people in all over the world, but I care about people in Florida, right? So, you know, I have different things that I'm trying to understand, different questions, right? But my big selfish question is, am I going to get home? And so I look at the data in hand and I say, I don't have enough information. Because like every hurricane, the predictions 3 or 4 days from now are, you know, it's going to go this way, it's going to go that way. It's like the bullet that killed JFK. It bounced all over the place, right? The hurricane models don't agree. And so there's this sort of, when do I know that I have enough data to answer a question like that? And that data that's discoverable, that's out there, is data that I have decided in my thought process I need to bring in before I make a decision here. So I know that I need data that's more recent, I need a whole bunch of things, right? So there's always going to be this little seesaw between the data that you have and the data you could go out and get. But if you go out and get it, it's going to take time, it's going to cost money. That person who's banging on the table saying, give me the answer, is going to start banging louder. So we need to think about what are the conditions that are going to allow us to decide that not only have we reached this dispositive threshold, but we've reached a point where we're comfortable using the data we have. And one of the ways that somebody always asks, well, how can I know anything about the data I don't already have? You're asking me to make a decision about whether I need to go get more data. I need to go get that data and look at it in order to decide whether or not it's useful. That's the regression approach. The new thinking approach is, hold on. What did I just tell you about what the single person tells us? We triangulate, we look at other things, right? So if he tells, I'm sorry I keep pointing at you, you're sitting right in front of me, I can't help it. Thank you. All right. So I know he's right-handed, no. So what happens here is I can say, all right, he says that he owns a consulting company and he's got 1,000 employees and he makes $1 billion a year. I want a company like that, right? Billion-dollar companies don't grow on trees. I probably would know about them. I never heard of them. I'm sorry, I didn't even look at where he works. I apologize. I'm not Dun & Bradstreet. No, just kidding. Yeah, so you do this all the time, right? So you look at what people say and you look at how true could it be. So I couldn't have picked a better person, right? So I can look at the number of employees versus the industry versus the revenue. I could look at other companies that are like that. I could look at, are there any industry trends? I could look at, maybe he's consulting, and I ask him, well, what kind of consulting? Well, military aircraft design. Well, okay, maybe, right? Because it's some kind of really niche corner of that. So I can use information I don't have, or I can ask, I call it asking 3 questions. It's been called Socratic reasoning. Like if you have a theory, you ask a few questions to converge on that theory. So if someone tells me, I've got some fabulous data for you, and this data is going to be really good for you in predicting, I don't know, let's talk about fraud again. This data is going to be really good in predicting fraud. My first question might be, why do you think so? And if they just tell me again how they have data that's going to be really good in predicting fraud, I kind of know maybe they haven't thought about it. Maybe what they're really saying is they have data that they hope I'm going to think is going to be good in predicting fraud, which is a different statement, right? But if they say, well, because it's about small businesses, and I know that fraud is more likely to occur in smaller businesses in ways that you can't already see, and so I think this data would be added. Well, now we're still talking, right? You made it through gate 1. My second question would be, where'd you get it? And if they say, well, we scraped it off the web, there's the door, right? Because I don't know if you're allowed to use that data, right? Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean you can steal it and exploit it commercially. You got to read all those terms on the bottom, right? So we play this game, right? And so I can assess this dispositive threshold by asking a few very pointed questions, and it's usually about 3, to get to the point where I know if we still have a horse race or not. Then there's always going to be this other set of data that's sitting inside a vault somewhere, data you're never going to get. And never is an important word. Not necessarily never, 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 but never in all reasonable likelihood. So this might be the information that's on your personal income tax return, Mr. Trump, right? I may not get that. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I'm in California. So it's the type of information that people hold dear, that is considered confidential. Or it might be data that's just literally non-existent yet. When they landed on the moon for the first time, they didn't know what the porosity, what the squishiness is of the surface of the moon. So they had those big feet that were circular, right, to help deal with the fact that the craft, when it landed, could have tipped. They wanted to spread out the weight as they landed. They still didn't really know if the surface of the moon was more like baby powder or more like sand. They had some theories, but they didn't know. It was in that existing but inaccessible data. So one of the things they did was you look at decision elasticity. How wrong do I have to be before the decision I'm making becomes really wrong? So in this case, really wrong would be a bunch of astronauts lying on their backs like turtles because they slipped and they can't get up, right? And the whole world watching, right? That would be really bad. So they had some rules they put in place. If the other guy falls, you can hand him something to help him get up, but you can't reach out and pull him up. Right? So one of the things that we do with this third set of data is we assess the decision elasticity to decide how wrong we have to be with the data that we're using before the decision that we're making changes. Get it? Really powerful stuff. So powerful thing number 1 here is realize that the data you have is always going to be the data you have and not all the data. By what right are you going to use it? Number 2 is what tools and techniques are you going to use to analytically assess the data you don't have? And step 3 is, what are you going to do? How wrong do you have to be before we're just making the wrong decision here with the data we're never going to get? And I promise you, if you think about data in these 3 buckets, if you're not already doing that, you'll be Superman or Wonder Woman. When you get back to whatever it is you do, people are going to go, wow, that's so cool. And the person will still be banging the table, but now you can say, look, just because I've reached the dispositive threshold doesn't mean I'm going to talk to you. And then, when you're looking for your other job, so here's 3 scenarios, and there's many, many, many scenarios. This isn't the 3 scenarios. This is 3 sort of obvious places along this journey. The size of the cans of data is like where you sit, right? So in the one on the left, this is where we typically are. We have lots of data in hand, and there's more data we could go get, but we probably have enough already, and we've sort of thought about it, and that other data exists, but it's not going to change our decision. Go on, make a decision, use lots of math, have a nice day. Lather, rinse, repeat. The second scenario is where we have just enough data. We've reached that dispositive threshold, But we kind of know there's a lot more data out there, and we probably should do some experimentation. Maybe we should try to crash something into the moon and see what happens to the pieces. You know, we do things because, you know, there's life and limb at stake, or there's there's risk, right? So there's another name for that second scenario. It's called a lawsuit, right? Because when you're wrong, people come back and say, let me get this straight. You used this data to make this decision, and you knew this other data was out there, and you just chose not to go look at it because you wanted to charge me for the answer. Well, that's not what I said. Well, what exactly did you say? Well, I said exactly that, right? Don't be that guy, right, or that person. And then the third one is what I would call a noble cause or a hopeless situation, depending on where you sit. So it's when you know the deck is stacked against you, you can estimate from what you have, but you clearly haven't reached the dispositive threshold. This is like the exoplanet research right now. We're trying to figure out if there's life on other planets, and we barely know that there's other planets. But it's a noble cause. We'd like to know if we're alone, right? And this, by the way, the first scenario doesn't always mean you can make a decision. MH370, the plane that's gone missing for quite some time right now, the data that they have collectively, they've got a ridiculous amount of data, puts that plane in 7 different arcs. Now we know the plane isn't in 7 different arcs, so you know at least 6/7 of that data is wrong. Ruh-roh, right? You have enough data to make a decision. In this case, you have enough data to make 7 decisions, right? So sometimes it's not, you know, it's not an abundance of wealth, it's an abundance of confusion over there. But over here on the right, it might just be, look, this is cyber terrorism, cyber security, cyber anything, right? We don't have all the information we'd like to have, but we have to do something, because if we do nothing, the bad guys win. The problem, cancer research, you know, chemotherapy, all of these things are scenarios that are sitting in the on the right-hand side. So my advice to you is at least figure out which one of these scenarios or one like it that you're in. At least know where you are, because knowing where you are is the first step to getting unlost. Somebody's going to tweet that. All right. The second part is we influence where we look. I have chosen these words very carefully. They're not accidental. We influence where we look. So when we talk about cyber anything, or when we talk about issues like permissible use or data sovereignty, let's talk about permissible use to get off crime for a minute. Let's say that you have a chamber of commerce for the town of Smallville in, you know, wherever Smallville is. Does anybody know where Smallville is supposed to be? It's somewhere out in the Midwest. Illinois. I was going to say that. All right. So you have the Smallville, Illinois Chamber of Commerce, and there's small businesses there, and they register with the Chamber of Commerce, and the Chamber of Commerce has a website, and they publish the names and addresses of the new donut shop and the new car dealership, right? And you notice that you're getting a lot of hits on your website, like thousands and thousands of hits per hour, and there's like 18 people that live in the town, right? Somebody's using that data for something else. And then you go and you sort of analyze the web traffic, and you figure out they're using it for some algorithm because they're trying to like peg small, medium, and large, and you're small, and you know, they're using it in some way you didn't intend, like the data from your fitness monitor being used to understand earthquakes, and you say, well, wait a minute, I'm going to charge you for that data because I'm going to monetize it. We hear words like monetize. We hear words like commercialize, right? And so all of a sudden you go on that website, and there's either technology that prevents you from just sort of taking it, or, you know, at least some kind of a statement that says contact the operator if you want to exploit this data for commercial purposes, blah, 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 right? And so what we've actually done there is we've changed the place we measure. That place that we were getting information has become a different place. It's exactly what happened to you when you clapped your hands the second time. The first time you clapped your hands, you had no idea what we were doing. The second time, you had the experience of having clapped your hands one time. I changed you. And by the time I got you to clap 3 times, you were pretty in sync, because I actually secretly trained you on how to do that by doing the first 2. I changed where I was measuring. And this happens all the time in data. All the time. Every single company in this room, I guarantee you, whatever you do, small, medium, or large, your company produces much more data than you're using. You're throwing away, if you're like the rest of the world, you're throwing away about 85% of the data you're creating. Seriously. And I can back that up if you don't believe me. So that means, and by the way, the data you're not throwing away is a specific type of data that has an understandable ontology, and it has a certain set of characteristics. It fits your regression model, whatever, right? So you're looking at the Mona Lisa, and you're looking at the lower left-hand corner, which is a black square. That environment that we're not looking at is changing while we're not looking at it. It's what we call a black cat in a dark room problem. The cat's moving. This is really scary. You should be really concerned about this. If you're not thinking about this with some part of your brain that isn't craving coffee right now, you need to be. Because this is, and I'm not trying to preach, I'm trying to help everybody make new mistakes, because I've already made some of these old mistakes, right? And so, you know, on the left, you have sort of the types of, this is mostly about bad behavior. You know, we look for money laundering and bust outs and shell companies and identity theft. Great, we got to keep doing that. But then we got to look at things like, oh, I don't know, the Barbie doll that talks that hackers figured out how to get into, and they were listening to the talking Barbie microphone when the kids left the Barbie doll in the parents' home office, and now they're shorting stock and robbing houses. Right? The Internet of Things is wonderful. Yes, it is. But right now, it's really an Internet of Things connected to the Internet. When those things start talking to each other in earnest, and start discovering each other without us telling them to go do it, and they start doing things algorithmically that were unintended, and they're connected to autonomous cars and drones and airplanes and or maybe other things, we better start thinking like that. We got to start thinking in front of some of these algorithms instead of waiting for some of those things to go wrong. So if you were to do a survey of how the laws that tell you how you may use data are changing, and we did, these are the kinds of things you would discover on the left. You know, that data privacy and cybersecurity and protection of the assets of a company, express consent, those are all the things that you see coming up in laws. Anybody here from Germany? I joke with my colleagues in Germany that if I call them on the cell phone, I can't say their name because I've digitally transported their name across the borders, and that's against the law, right? Now, of course, they don't enforce it to that level, but technically, I shouldn't be doing that, right? Our laws will always be behind our technology. It's just the nature of things, right? So that what we can do will always be in front of what we say we should do and what we say we're not allowed to do. That's just the nature of legislation. Sometimes they try to write legislation out in front where they see something going, and then the innovators just go in a slightly different direction, and that doesn't work very well. So we have all kinds of legislation right now to protect the airspace, right? When the planes fly in and they fly into a Class B protected airspace, they've got to like ask for permission to do practically anything that they do, right? Well, those laws didn't anticipate drones. And so now that there's a bunch of requests and sort of guidelines, like don't go more than a certain distance from an airport, but they're not actually laws, at least as far as I know yet. We're getting there, right? So, you know, we wind up trying to adapt laws that already exist, and I'm sure this happened when airplanes first started to come out. They probably had laws for what you could do in hot air balloons or something, and now all of a sudden there's things with engines. And so we have to think about, you know, how the landscape around us is changing to react to the data that we're creating and the capability. When I say data, I mean data and analytic capability. So there's a yin-yang going on here. These things are changing, we're changing them, they're changing us, the environment is changing, lots of change. If you fear change, get over it. The only person that likes change all the time is a wet baby. We've got to move through this. We've got to work on this. And then last, we influence what we find. Now, what am I talking about there? Well, if I said, for example, you win. Well, what did I win? Well, you won this hat. And then you say, well, I don't want a hat. I already have a hat. Well, it's not just a hat. It's to help protect you from the sun. Well, yeah, that's what a hat does. Yeah, but not like this. You see, this hat has ventilation in the back to keep your head cool while it's protecting you from the sun. Well, my other hat doesn't do that, but I don't really care. It's kind of cold out. Yes, but you got to understand. And then we go on and on and on, and I keep trying to redefine that hat until it's something that he really, really wants, right? Of course, now he treasures it because it came from me. But, and anyone else would like a hat, just ask me a question in a minute. So my point is that we influence what we find. There's things like the fact that we want to find a certain thing. It's called confirmation bias. right? So I'm going to give you a whole bunch of data, and I'm going to ask you to use that data to study the relationship between speed limits and car accidents. And you're part of the Traffic Safety Commission, whatever it's called, and secretly what you want, probably, I don't know, is you want it to be true that speed limits matter in some way, and that if we modify the speed limit and we ignore personal safety, more people will die. That seems reasonable. But you've got to be scientific enough to ask a question in a way that says, what is the relationship between, and not go out and try to prove that that's true. There was a recent study done where they were trying to prove the relationship between building codes and safe buildings. And it turned out, through a very complicated set of analysis, that they proved that the safest city in the world for deaths by fire per capital city, was La Paz, Bolivia. And they don't have a lot of building codes compared to someplace like Tokyo. It turns out that La Paz, Bolivia is the highest altitude capital city in the world, and the absence of oxygen was more of a predictor of dying in a fire than more building codes. Sorry. But then, maybe you should make more building codes about the combustibility of materials than ingress and egress. So there are ways to use this data if you just think like a scientist and don't try to prove what you believe to be true. So then all of a sudden here comes machine learning, and now it gets worse because we build algorithms that go out and try to prove stuff. So now it's not people trying to prove it anymore, it's algorithms. And so we have sort of a function, and we're trying to approach that function through machine learning. Is anybody here a massive machine learning expert? I say this with great respect. I've written these algorithms, but people who do this for a living tend to be very zealous about it. Of course we can. And I can tell you exactly what you're thinking right now. I swear, I really can. I promise you right now, I know exactly what you're thinking. You're thinking, I don't know what you're thinking, right? So you can influence the person, the thing, the algorithm, the place, and then it influences you when you start to look at the answer, and then you tune the algorithm because it's working, right? And you get it to work even more like you wanted it to work in the first place. And then guess what? It works that way, right? And so it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. And then, the car, there's a very famous cartoon where there's a car driving off a cliff, and the GPS is saying recalculating. Right? That's not an absence of data problem, that's a gravity problem, right? So we need to think through what we're doing with machine learning, what we're doing with autonomous functionality, what we're doing with things like the Internet of Things, which could be a blessing or a ridiculous curse, and I don't know which. It'll probably be both. So we have to think about, are we enabling cyber terrorism? Are we enabling really bad things? Are we teaching ourselves to stop learning why we would calculate the square root because there's a square root button on the calculator? Or are we just using that as a convenience to move on and do lots of square roots in the time it used to take us to do a few square roots? There's a big difference between those two things. So then all of a sudden here comes cognitive computing. So machine learning is all about machines sort of using algorithms and looking at data and trying to get closer and closer to some sort of function, some objective function. Cognitive computing is, let me help you understand your question instead of let me help you understand the answer. Really cool stuff, but even more fraught with this multiplicative problem of error, right? If you have one assumption that's 80% likely to be correct and another one that's 80% likely to be correct, and you make a decision based on those two, you're 64% likely to be correct. 80 times 80, right? So you got to be careful, 0.8 times 0.8. A good example of this that was brought out by someone on my staff, was a really smart guy, scary smart guy. His example was the Garden of Eden. If you think about all of the literature that is accessible to mankind right now, and you curate all of that literature, and you ask a cognitive computing stack to describe the fruit in the Garden of Eden, you'll get a description of an apple. Because there's literature, there's poetry, there's songs, all about Eve and the apple. And then you go back to the original story in Genesis, and it talks about the fruit of the tree of knowledge. The word apple is not in there. But the collective knowledge, the collective data that mankind has produced has turned this into an apple. It's not an apple. It may be an apple. It doesn't actually matter whether it's an apple or not. It could have been a kumquat. The point is that the data will say it's definitely an apple. We are way beyond that dispositive threshold. It's an apple. Move on, right? And the reality is we don't know a lot about the data, and having more data with machine learning and cognitive computing and things like this without the problem formulation and the data science and the thinking that we do to ask these right questions, we will just accelerate the pace with which we hit the wall. Make sense? All right. So it can be very ominous as well as very powerful. When we think about innovation in our groups, we talk about innovation all the time. We wave our arms in the air, we look longingly, and we talk about innovation. We haven't defined innovation. Innovation could be what most of us think about, which is new products and new solutions, or it could just be smaller unsolved problems. It could just be new ways of thinking about a problem. If we think about the data journey that large organizations go through, we've moved from early adoption to integrating into a value chain. We've done things like, we know how to put a lot of data in one place now. We've moved from ingestion to curation. We know now how to bring in lots of data. Now we're starting to think about how we use lots of data. We've moved from an analytic focus, which is like very mathy, to a holistic focus, like what does it mean, why do I care, that kind of thing. So I believe we are on this journey, and I believe we are moving well. I believe the leadership mindset has changed from our initial focus of being aware of a skills gap to now thinking about not only do I have to hire the right people, I have to change the behavior and the knowledge of the people in my organization. So we're moving. When I look at the world, I think we're making progress. I think we're not making progress fast enough. If I reflect on this journey, and I think you'll have access to these slides, the biggest thing I would say to you is start with a question. Don't start with a technology. Don't start with a data set. Start with a problem that you want to solve. That's a very good place to be. Think about the skills gap, not only of the people you're hiring, but of yourself. Because the skills that made you successful to get where you are not the skills you're going to need going forward in this crazy world. And finally, I want to leave you with some thoughts around this computable data. We are now able to ask questions we could never ask before in ways we could never think about. Mark Twain said it really well. He said that truth is stranger than fiction because fiction has to obey rules and truth doesn't. Right? This is a crazy, crazy, crazy world. Many of you here are here because you're interested in new opportunity, right? Salesforce, customer relationship management, all these things are about finding new. Well, you don't want to find new problems, right? You want to find new opportunities. So this kind of thinking can really be very, very powerful back in your organization. Back in my organization, we think about this every single day. I promise not to read this to you, but we do lots and lots of stuff in partnership with Data.com and lots of other fine organizations to actually think through problems like this. If anybody wants to talk about it, I can take a question or two now, or I'll be hanging around here for quite some time. Yes, sir.
How do you balance the need for looking for more data, or the desire to look for more data, against scope of work and billable hours?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to actually, I think you have to start with, before you start analyzing, you have to start asking that question of how would I know when I had enough data to make this decision? And then you have to define what those characteristics are, and you have to get everybody clear on them so that you realize you're making a trade-off, because there's an opportunity cost. Every minute you do more work, you're not moving on to the next problem. Yes?
For an organization first starting to implement the use of predictive analytics, what would be your recommendation before starting?
Number one is don't jump to the math. Focus on the problem formulation, predicting what and why, and ask those questions. Remember I talked about the 3 questions, right? Figure out what those 3 formative questions are, and then move from there because the predictive analytics is a tool, right? And I just got done saying don't jump to a tool without a question. So how do you know that that's the right way to go? And if you want to talk about what your 3 questions might be, I'll be happy to talk to you later. The door is open and I'm getting the hook. I'll get one more question.
So I work in a very, very small organization.
I need to ask you all to do one thing before you walk out. Yeah, sorry.
There's only 4 of us in our organization. I am the data person.
Okay.
So how do you make sure I need a safeguard to check myself because I will hunt for the data that I want.
Yes.
What do you ask yourself?
Awesome question. First of all, you're the data person, so whatever you say is right is true anyway. But what you need to do is find organizations that you can attach yourself with. There's lots of them in universities, think tanks, all those kinds of things, where you join these communities of practice and you expand your reach through the thinking of other people. I can give you some ideas offline. Now, we started with clapping one single time. Now I'd like you to clap as many times as you can. Thank you very much.